Greetings, Stargate Eagles. So I paused the first part of this section on crime. This is part two to finish up the section about crime. And so here's where we left off. We left off with the criminal justice system, right? So when crime is committed, especially in our country, there is a whole system built around dealing with people who participate in deviance, specifically crime. So the criminal justice system has several parts, which are listed here. They are the police, courts, corrections, and then a little separate piece that we know as the juvenile justice system, which hopefully most of you are familiar with, at arm's length instead of knowing it intimately. But so once a crime is committed and reported, it falls under the criminal justice system jurisdiction. And the most kind of familiar extension that we see of the criminal justice system are the police. And so I'm not going to tell you what the police are, but they are, of course, in charge of enforcing the laws of our society. But some notes that this section makes about police and some terms and ideas to know is they highlight the idea of police discretion, which is this idea that the police have considerable power to decide who is actually arrested when crimes are committed. Because of the size of our particular society, 350 million people or so, it is not possible to arrest every individual who participates in a crime. The police actually have a tremendous amount of discretion and power about what crimes they address and who they actually arrest. Research has indicated that police officers consider several factors when deciding whether to make an arrest. First, they consider the seriousness of the offense. Less serious offenses are more likely to be ignored. Second, the wishes of the victim are taken into consideration. If the offense is serious or if the suspect is male, victims generally press for an arrest. That's just some sociology research. Third, the police consider the suspect's attitude. An uncooperative suspect is more likely to be arrested than one who is polite or apologetic. Fourth, the police are more likely to make an arrest if bystanders are present. In doing so, the police reinforce that they are in control. So those are kind of some big ideas that research shows. And you could take a couple of things of those, like you may be disturbed by the idea that male criminals are more likely to be arrested than female criminals. You may be alarmed by the idea that, like, if you commit a crime but you are polite to the officer, you may get away with it versus just being rude to a police officer. That's not necessarily, let's say, fair and objective. But again, the police in our society have a tremendous amount of discretion at actually processing and undertaking arrests of criminals. And then this section makes a note about this idea of racial profiling, which is an issue in the United States of America. And racial profiling is a complicated topic, but the general definition is that racial profiling is the practice of assuming that non-white Americans are more likely to commit crimes. So the issue of racial profiling has become an important political topic, particularly in the aftermath of the events such as the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And this is one of those things where if I saw you face to face, I would try to gauge how familiar you were with this particular event, but I can't do that with online learning. So I think my activity will probably be around this idea for the first half of this sociology week. But if you had to parse out some really tricky ideas of the criminal justice system here, it would be hard to deny that racial profiling doesn't play a role in this other idea that a majority of arrests and the majority of the U.S. prison population are, of course, non-white Americans. There has to be a link here between this concept and then the very reality of our current criminal justice system. Other things are is the court system. This is the next piece of the criminal justice system. Courts have two powers. They hold trials to determine whether accused people are guilty of crimes. And then, of course, if they are guilty, courts assign punishment. So, one concept that this section highlights is the idea of plea bargaining. And then an interesting statistic here is that 90% of criminal cases go to, this should say, plea bargaining, not pleas bargaining. So only about like 10% then of criminal cases go to trial, right? You may, if you're into those kind of crime dramas, you may be surprised by this, but the vast majority of criminal arrests go to plea bargaining. And plea bargaining is the process of legal negotiation that allows an accused person to plead guilty to a lesser charge and sentence. So the idea of holding an actual trial, and because of the high volume of criminal cases and the gigantic population of the United States, it is just unreasonable to think that the courts could have a trial for all those cases. And so plea bargaining is a legal method which a person can, plead guilty to the crime for a lightened sentence, because it's just too expensive and it's too time consuming to hold jury trials for every single criminal case. So you get plea bargaining as a vital tool for the court system and for criminals. Corrections, or the prison system. So corrections, these are the sanctions used to punish criminals. And again, so like prison is kind of the most popular idea here. The corrections department, the Department of Corrections, essentially the prison system where people who commit crimes are locked up and serve time for crimes that they have committed. So corrections, these are the kind of formal sanctions that we use to punish deviants in our society. And corrections, or the prison system, serve four basic functions for society. And one maybe our more baser ideas, is retribution, which is the idea that punishing criminals serves as a socially acceptable act of revenge for victims and society. Right? If somebody violates the norms and behaviors that keep our society together, correction serves as a way to just punish those people, to get retribution. Deterrence is the second one, where corrections are intended to discourage offenders from committing future crimes and make the rest of society think twice about committing a crime. Right? So there is this kind of cynical view of human beings where maybe a lot of us don't commit criminal acts because we're just afraid of being punished for it. Not that we actually think it's wrong or bad to do something, but we fear the punishment, and so we don't then commit those crimes. And then, of course, people who serve time, the idea is that once they get out, corrections should deter them from committing a future crime. Now, a more recent that's not the correct way to put it, but a more recent popular idea, as we go on through time here, is the idea of using corrections as a place for rehabilitation. Or corrections is a place to reform criminals so that they could return as law-abiding citizens. So there is a growing call among people in corrections and lawmakers and people with power that, if we're going to take criminals and lock them away for a period of time, it doesn't serve society any purpose to then just release those people if you haven't changed their behaviors. And different societies do this differently. The United States is not amazing at rehabilitating criminals, and we'll actually look at some statistics later that show that. But you can look at other countries, and let me pull this out for you, because why not? Like, if you look up Swedish prison, the Swedish prison cells look very different from what we see in America. And the idea here kind of being this idea that it doesn't actually serve to just punish criminals. So you see like a TV here, some decent furnishing, right? And the idea that if you treat people humanely, specifically criminals, you can help rehab them and bring them back as full-fledged members of society versus, not actually accomplishing anything with the time that you lock somebody up in prison. Let's look up a U.S. prison cell, right? I mean, here's like the classic, right? like the bars, the concrete beds versus kind of the nice furnishings, more like college dorm room in different societies. So different societies do this differently. But that is a growing popular idea that if you're going to lock up criminals, you should look to rehab them so that when you release them back into society, they're contributing members to society. And then the fourth basic function is social protection, which is the idea that if you limit the freedom of people who commit crimes, you protect society. If they're behind bars, they're not out committing further crimes. And then the ultimate sanction is the death penalty, with that very simple idea that if you kill a criminal, they are no longer going to then commit crimes in the future because they are dead. So you have these four basic functions of corrections. So that idea that I was mentioning before about like rehabilitation is tied to this idea of like what is the effectiveness of corrections in a society. So one problem in the United States is that according to the U.S. Department of Justice, 68% of released prisoners will be charged with new crimes, and 50% will return to prison within 3 years of their release. So, if you lock people up and you don't actually accomplish anything with that time, and then you release them and they commit further crimes, not only are you not rehabbing people, you're not bettering people, you're then taking criminals, holding them for a period of time, and then you lose the social protection because they go back out into the world and commit further crimes. This idea is called recidivism. Recidivism is the term for repeated criminal behavior. So, final note here from corrections. Courts can assign punishments ranging from fines to probation to imprisonment. The majority of convicted criminals are punished through fines and probation. However, in the case of serious crimes, particularly murder, rape, and robbery, prison sentences are common. Punishments can also vary by ethnicity. In some cases, African Americans and Hispanics receive harsher punishments than white people for committing the same crimes. For example, African Americans are arrested for drug possession more than 3 times as often as whites, according to a 2009 report from the advocacy group Human Rights Watch. And so, yes, we have these imbalances in our society when we both treat crimes by race and when we treat crimes by sex. So, a final note is the idea that there's the juvenile justice system, and this is a separate part of the criminal justice system that deals with young people under 18. So this is a tricky subject in terms of like what do you do with young people whose today we know their brains aren't fully developed, they're not fully in control of their emotions and their actions, and they can't process the way adults do. And so really it's a recent phenomenon since like the 1960s to actually treat juveniles, people who are under 18, in a different category than people over 18. And so I think we're all familiar with this idea that young people are treated differently if they commit crimes. They go through different programs to try to rehabilitate them before you try them as adults. And this has not always been the case. Before the 1960s, really, there's lots of formal structures on how to charge adults who commit crimes, but there wasn't a great system to treat young people. And really, in the past, it was this idea that like if a young person committed a crime, the system would just hold on to them longer than usual because there wasn't a great separate system to try to rehabilitate young people who committed crimes. So this differs, how young people are treated when they commit crimes between states. Some states, even if you're under 18, you can be tried as an adult for committing a crime. In some states, that's not possible. So there's a recognition based again on like psychology and brain development about like how do you treat people under 18 who commit crimes, and that's part of the juvenile justice system. And I had one last thought and I forgot it. Oh, my last thought is just to leave you with this thought about like, we established this idea about people under the age of 18 because of brain development not being totally in control and culpable for committing criminal acts. I think it's an interesting idea that the more we know today is that like your brain again isn't fully developed until 25. And so what, maybe in the future there's some ramifications about what our criminal justice system looks like tied to brain development and then your personal responsibility for participating in deviant behavior.